Anybody here who hasn't been here for the last 2 sessions and therefore doesn't have a paper assignment? Ladies and gentlemen, we're going to. There's a fairly good chance that we're going to get out of here early tonight. And the earlier we start, the earlier we'll get out. So why don't you stop talking and let me get started, if that's okay with everybody. The reason we might get out early is that as a result of one question that came up over there, and then a discussion I had after class with somebody, I concluded that I had not done a very good job of explaining air's position, and talking about air's position and then what's wrong with it is what wraps up our discussion of free will. So that's all I'm going to do tonight. We might have some time left over, but it's kind of silly to jump from there to the Euthyphro. But for next time, we will be talking about the Euthyphro. The rest of the course, and we're going to run out of time. I'm not going to try to jam it all down your throat till we run out. But we're going to be talking about moral and political issues. And the Euthyphro, let me just tell you why I start with that. When you get to very basic questions like whether anything is either right or wrong, and if so, why, what's morality all about, a very large number of people are tempted to say that rightness and wrongness, goodness and badness are determined by, or they arise from, God in some way or other. And Plato in the Euthyphro has this, sorry folks, in this dialogue, he has this character, Euthyphro, who's about to go prosecute his father for murder, and Socrates is at the same courthouse. He's about to be tried for corrupting the youth. And so Socrates is picking Euthyphro's brain, since he obviously knows so much about this stuff, or else he wouldn't be prosecuting his father. And in the end, Socrates raises a very interesting question that comes up not just as it does in the dialogue about the Greek gods, but about the idea that morality somehow emanates from or is determined by some being somewhere. So when I talk about it, we switch from talking about the Greek gods to talking about the God we talked about earlier in this course, about the idea that rightness and wrongness somehow is determined by or emanates from God. It's a very interesting problem. It's just as big a problem now as it was for the Greeks. So that's where we're going to start talking about it, and then we'll get on to more contemporary stuff. Okay, so Ayer. Ayer's a compatibilist, and he thinks that determinism and freedom are compatible. He starts, I'm going to go fairly quickly over the beginning of this, where Ayer starts out talking about the possibility that the universe may be completely deterministic in the sense that there's no event that ever happens that isn't caused by some other event in accordance with the causal laws that govern the universe, okay? It's also possible that's not true. Maybe there are some events that aren't like that. And we just scientists keep on probing and trying to understand things they don't yet understand. They may come up against a brick wall at some point and discover that there are things that just don't have explanations. But, of course, what Ayer's interested in is somebody saying, no, there's another reason aside from science why determinism is not true, namely that human beings have free will. Right? Human beings sometimes do things of their own free will, meaning that nothing caused them to do it. Right? And so he goes through this short series of imaginary exchanges with somebody who's defending free will. And what he does at each stage is to say, look, let's be concrete about this. Suppose we have this person, I'll just call her S, and the claim is that S did A of her own free will. Okay, and what Ayer wants to ask is, well, what's the explanation of her doing it? Why did she do this of her own free will? Which is kind of a funny question. I mean, this person has this picture, right, that this is not, we're not talking about Chisholm now, we're just talking about some person or other, some philosopher who wants to argue that we sometimes do things of our own free will, basically with the idea in mind that nothing made me do it, nothing caused me to do it. So when you ask about this, what caused her to do this of her own free will, you do have a kind of a funny question. But Ayer wants to say, look, if nothing caused this particular thing to happen, her doing A, then it was just a random occurrence. Right? It's as much as my arm flying out in my old scenario, right, hitting you in the nose. There is no explanation, right? This just happened, this act of her doing something of her own free will. And that turns into what the person wants to say is that something like this, S did A because she chose to do A. So there's an explanation of the actual doing of the act, right? The act is the result of something else, namely this. She chooses to do A, and that leads to her doing A. At which point, Ayer wants to say, okay, what about this act here? What caused her to make that choice? Either something caused her to make that choice, or it's just this random, inexplicable event. It has no explanation, right? It just happened that she chose to make this, to do A. So what you finally wind up with is the person saying, look, there is an explanation of why she chose to do A, and it looks like this. She chose to do A because she has a certain character. It's something that just the way she's put together psychologically, morally, whatever. She has a certain character, right? You know, when we talk about people being of good character, this is the kind of character we're talking about. It's her character, her being the kind of person that she is, that explains her making that choice, which explains her performing the act. So you get one last round of this. Ayer says, how'd she come to have this particular character? How'd that happen? And the idea, the person he's imagining himself arguing with thinks that a person's character is something that they themselves develop. They become the character they are deliberately. They work at it, so to speak. It's their whole history of how they've behaved, corrected themselves, listened to people, whatever. They've become a certain kind of character. And so the question, how does it happen that she has this character, right, rather than some other character, is Ayre's last contribution to this back and forth, okay? Okay, she has a certain character. When she was doing things that led to this character, did they just happen at random? Or was she actually, or was did something cause her to do it? If it's just a random act, then everything else that follows from it, right, is the result of this random act, and so you don't have here an idea of free will at all. You have some random act that happens, and then it causes other things to happen. So you've got to think that she's responsible for the character she has. Something caused her along the way, right, to do this, or else you just have this inexplicable event and its consequences. So he pushes and pushes on this, but at this point, what Ayre says is, so far you haven't given me a picture of how to understand a free act, right? Because I have two choices. Either at each stage what happens is determined, in which case according to you it's not free, or it's just random, right? In which case I say it's not free because it's just this random inexplicable event. But, Ayre says, what's true is that the acts that we tend to think of as cases where we want to say somebody actually did something of their own free will are cases where they're acting in character. So one more time I'll refer back to my description of imagining my own case, right, where I wind up giving some money to the Heart Association for various reasons, right? I have certain beliefs about how I ought to behave. I have the capacity to do it. I'm not being pressured by any blah, 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 right? The whole story. Or, you know, dream up your own, where you would think, if there is such a thing as free will, this is as good an example as you're going to get, okay? So, Ayre has this idea that if we don't come at it with philosophical prejudices, just try to think about what we've always thought of as somebody doing something of their own free will, and therefore we either want to praise them for it if it was something noble or good that they did, or else criticize them if they deserve criticism. If you think about cases like that, just the kind you've always had in your head, believe me, many times you wanted to thank somebody for doing something pretty nice, or give them a good knock upside the head if they did something bad. Ayre's contention is that in cases like that, if you think about it, you're going to realize that if you knew the person, it's not surprising that they did it. It's the kind of thing you would expect them to do in those circumstances. So, the question that Ayre thinks we need to finally ask once we get that squarely in front of our minds, that what we typically think of as free act are things we think we could explain in terms of the nature of the person. We need to ask whether we can hope that having free will turns out to be consistent with determinism. Right? Your character determines at a given time how you behave, more or less. And so what you'd like to think is that these cases where it looks to us like somebody did something of their own free will, they're also in character with the person. Maybe we can just put the two of them together. The character, once it's developed, is responsible for how the person behaves. So there is an explanation. Their behavior is determined in part by their character, but they're free. Right? In that case, right, well, I shouldn't say in that case. So at this point, Ayre says, look, people have thought about this the wrong way forever. What you want to think about when you're thinking about what the difference is between being free and not being free, acting of your own free will or not, is not whether your behavior was determined or not, but whether roughly anything's interfering with you. If it's just up to you what to do and you just decide you're going to do it and then you go ahead and do it because that's what you feel like doing and that's what you decided to do, then you're acting of your own free will. So, it's at this point that Ayer gives you 3 examples of the kinds of things that can't be factors in the situation if you're going to say somebody is free. You can't have, well, why don't I just write out an English sentence, more or less English sentence. S did A of her own free will. I hope you're going to choke on this phrase here. Only if, well, let me not shove that down your throat. Let me do it along the way. In order for it to be true, that S did A of her own free will. It must be true that she didn't, this is turning out to be a hell of a long sentence here, she didn't do A as a result of being compelled or constrained in any way. It's 2 different ideas here, okay? So the short way to describe that is nothing's interfering with her doing whatever the hell she wants to do. Nobody's compelling her to do it. She's not suffering under any constraints. And the example that Ayer gives of compulsion compelling someone. The example he gives of that is holding a gun to somebody's head. And not just holding the gun there in a nice peaceful way, but threatening them, right? So for Ayer, compulsion is the bringing of a serious threat to someone of what's going to happen if they don't do what the person's telling them to do. Okay, so it's an external threat of something far worse than they're just deciding they won't do it after all. And then he's got 2 kinds of constraints, right, that people can suffer. One is, I'm just going to use a phrase he doesn't use, but total psychological domination. The idea here being that it sometimes happens that one person can have such control over somebody else. They don't have to threaten them with a gun, right? They just have to make it clear what they expect them to do, and however the person squirms about doing it, they're going to do it, right? They may not want to do it, but one person has some kind of serious psychological control over another person. And then the second is kind of constraint is you suffer from some kind of internal condition, a malcondition, a malfunction, whatever. The example he actually gives is kleptomania. Okay, so you can have the two external and internal constraints, right? There's no threats involved in either of these cases. Nevertheless, right, you are not, there's something wrong with the way you're functioning. The way he actually describes it is your conscious debate with yourself about whether or not to do this thing, in either situation, where you're dealing with somebody who dominates you, or where you suffer from kleptomania. Your thought processes that are a lot like everybody else's about whether to do this act or not, whether to steal something. I mean, you could steal something because you've got kleptomania. You could also steal something because somebody has got total control of you and they're getting you to do it, whatever the example is. The debate you may go through with yourself actually doesn't have anything to do with the outcome. Right? The outcome's already set. Your kleptomania is going to lead to your stealing, however much you argue with yourself or debate with yourself. Or the other person is just going to see to it. You will, in fact, steal if they've got strong enough control over you, even though they're not threatening you. Okay, so none of this stuff can be true if you're acting. If somebody's acting of their own free will, then they're not acting because they're being compelled by a threat, or because they have these kinds of liabilities, constraints on their degree of freedom in just the ordinary sense, right? Okay, so now I'm going to write a bunch of other stuff, which is just straight out of Ayer's summary here. Put it up so I can point at it a bunch. The first is just what Ayer says that doing something of your own free will consists in. So, S did A of your own free will. What that means, I'll go back to my own. What this means by definition, here's what that means. That in the first place, obviously, S did A. But secondly, what's true is that, and this is a phrase which I probably haven't even used since we started talking about Ayer, but it goes back to when we talked about Holbach, is this. S could have done something else. And this turns out to be a magic phrase. It comes in here because in part, I'm now going to, the next thing I'm going to do is tell you what this means, right? Ayer gives you a definition of what it means to say somebody could have done something else than what they did. And it involves all this stuff here, okay? But this idea that, this way of thinking about free will is pretty common across the board. I mean, Chisholm, Holbach, and Ayer will all agree that in order for somebody to do something of their own free will, it has to be true that they could have done something else. Holbach's perfectly happy with it. He thinks nobody ever could do anything else. In order for them to be free, they have to have been able to do something else, so they're never free. And Chisholm certainly agrees that you have to have been able to do something else. Either not bring about that brain event or bring about some other brain event or whatever. And here it takes center stage. I mean, this is where the rubber hits the road and where you can finally see, I think, what's wrong with this idea. So here's what Ayer says about what two means. How about if I do this? Two means by definition this. And I'll use some different numbers here, okay? 3, that S would have done something else if she had chosen to. Okay, so this just gets the idea then it's up to her whether to do A or not. She did A, but she could have done something else, and the real meat of that is that she would have done something else if she felt like it. If she decided to do something else, she would have done something else. Okay, then you get this. Then what else has to be true is that S did A because she chose to do A. There is an explanation of why she did what she did. Namely, she decided to, right? And that led her to do it. Led to her doing it. And finally, S was not compelled or constrained to do A. Because see, if you did A of your own free will, then you did A because you decided to do A, you chose to. You could have done something else, you would have. If you decided to do something else, you would have. And you weren't compelled or constrained. You have to have all of this in here. If you remember back to the case of the gun to your head, the case of compulsion. Right? Suppose somebody holds a gun to my head and wants my wallet, and I hand over the wallet, right? Well, it's nevertheless true. Right? You want to think I didn't do this of my own free will. It's nevertheless true that I would have done something else if I decided to. If I decided to hell with you, I'm not giving you my wallet, then I would have done something else, right? So it's not, you can't, this isn't enough, right, to say, well, you're acting as long of your own free will. As long as, you know, you could have done something else, you would have done something else if you wanted to. I could have done something else, I would have done something else, namely keep my wallet, if I decided to, right? And so you also need the idea here that in doing what I did, I was not compelled. Because even though it's true that I could have done something else, I was under a serious threat to my life. Okay, there it all is. One thing to say about it is that it seems to me to be a fairly decent description of how somebody who sat down and thought about this without worrying about the whole philosophical history of worries about this, something that would sound fairly plausible. This is sort of the thing we mean by somebody acting of their own free will. They did it. They could have done something else. They did it because they decided to do it. Right? And nobody was interfering with them. From inside or outside, there was no interference with their arriving at their decision and doing whatever they decided to do. So, you know, it's far from a crazy idea. For example, it may not sound as crazy as I think the libertarians sound with their with their imminently caused brain events. But this thing has got huge problems. So, yeah, I'm looking at my hen scratch here. So here's a representation of what actually happened. Okay? What actually happened is there was this event. I don't know why I've got three of these, but I do Z, which causes X, which causes Y, which causes this, namely S chose to do A, and that led to S's doing. Right? This is a deterministic picture, right? We're talking about determinism. Nothing happens without a cause. Right? So there's some story. This may, you know, this thing that causes her to to do A may involve her character in some way or other, right? But whatever it is, there's no gap in the causal chain here, right? Now, what has to be true? The crucial thing to consider here now is that Ayer says has to be true is that S could have done something else. So here's what has to be possible. Yeah, right. We'll call this what could have happened. What could have happened is that Z caused Y, which caused, why do I have a, never mind, so I got the stupid order in the first place, I'll keep it, okay, Z caused X, which caused Y, let me move this down so I've got more room here, Z causes X, causes Y, but now, you could have done something else. You could have chosen to do something else. So what happens now is that instead of X leading to Y, yeah, no, that's okay, right. X leads to Y, right? But instead of X choosing to do A, what happens is that S chooses to do B. And once she chooses to do B, S does B. This very simple representation of what Ayer is claiming has to be true. It's got to be true that she could have done something else. Meaning by that if she had chosen to do something else, she would have done something else, right? So if this had happened, instead of her choosing to do B instead of choosing to do A, then sure enough she would have done something else. She would have done B instead of A. Nobody's interfering with her, it's just up to her. So once she makes this choice, that's what she's going to do. But we've got this chain going here, a deterministic chain. Z causes X, causes Y. We saw it up here. And the next thing that happened after Y happened was it caused her to do A. Well, a cause just is something, according to Ayer and any of these guys, any determinist. A cause is something that always has the same effect. I think A's cause B's just means that A's are always followed by B's. It means at least that. According to Ayer, that's all it means. If I'll go back to the example of the baseball hitting the window, right? If the baseball hitting the window caused the window to break, then if you ever again get exactly the same situation, same weight of baseball, if it's wet, then it's heavier than a dry ball, but exactly the same thing, the same weight, the same velocity, the same angle, same kind of glass, same thickness of glass, everything's the same, right? So it really is true that that ball hitting that window caused it to break. Then anytime you get exactly those circumstances again, you will get a broken window again, right? That's the concept, part of the concept of a cause and an effect. The cause is sufficient for the effect. It brings it about. So, we've got the story up here that Ayer's perfectly happy with. There's this deterministic story. Something caused this choice, which led to her, which caused her to do A. But now he wants to talk about what would have happened if she'd chosen to do B instead. So you're looking at this funny situation in which supposedly there's this causal chain, but now he wants to say, well, she might have chosen to do something else. If she, or at least if she had chosen to do something else, then she would have done something else. But I mean, what are we supposed to do with that, right? One thing to say about that is that she couldn't have chosen to do anything else because Y is there, and Y is going to cause her to do A. Right? So she can't do B once Y is there. It's enough to bring about her choice of A. So for starters, you've got that problem, right? He's looking at a hypothetical. If she had decided to do something else, she would have done something else. And if Holbach were around, this is exactly what he would say. Yeah, well, that's a nice thing to say, but notice that she couldn't have chosen to do anything else because there's this event Y that's happened, and it's causing her to do this. You can't have her, you can't, I mean, you can talk about what if the world were different, but this is the way the world is. Y causes her to do A. And you're not going to change the history of the world here, so Y is there. She can't do this. Whatever troubles there are about the notion of causation, you may remember that Chisholm thinks there's a big problem, and he's right, there are problems about causation. But air, you don't have to have much of any idea of causation to have a problem here. Namely, the idea that air is God. If to say that one thing causes another is just to say that things like that are always followed by things like that, right? To say that baseballs break windows, right? Baseball collisions break windows. Then baseball collisions with windows are always followed by the breaking of the window. And this is Air's story, that we've got this causal chain going here, deterministic causal chain. This caused this. Well, if it did, then at a minimum that means whenever Y happens, S is going to choose to do A. So if he imagines her choosing to do B instead, even though Y is there, he's contradicting himself, and he's got a crazy idea in his head. Now, and you can't get out of this by going backwards farther, right? You can say, well, you know, there might not, Y might not have been there. There might have been something else there, like M or something, right? But you can't do that because X is there, and it's enough to cause Y, right? And you go back here and let this be P back here, which is colored, right? You can't do it. You can't, at any point in the causal chain, you can't say, well, if instead of this being here, something else were there, because nothing else could have been there. The thing that was there was determined to be there by something that already happened. So this is a huge problem for, I think it's the central problem for compatibilists. They need this idea. Everybody agrees you've got to have this, you've got to have free will. It's got to be true that the person could have done something else. And according to these guys, what it means to say that S could have done something else is that she would have done something else if she'd made a different choice. Well, who cares what she would have done if she'd made a different choice if she couldn't possibly have made a different choice? She didn't have the capacity to make a different choice because something was causing her to choose to do A. Now, that's one problem. There's a separate problem. If you get this issue, that anybody want to, if I said it often enough and differently enough, anybody want to ask me anything that might help make it clearer? Okay, here's the thing to compare all this with. And let me get some stuff out of the middle of the alphabet here. Okay, J causes K, causes L, and that causes, well, here, we'll stop there. K causes this, right? That I release the child. Okay? By release, I just mean let go of it, right? releasing the chalk means that the chalk falls. Now, here's the question. Could the chalk have done anything else? And I've said several times in here, no, the chalk couldn't have done anything else, right? What the hell is it going to do, right? But the way these guys talk about what I could have done or what S could have done, all it means is, right, in the case of, sorry, I'll just do this little thing here, right? S chooses A, right, causes, S does A. And these guys want to say that she could have done something else if this had been different, if she made a different choice, right? If she chose to do B, she would have done B instead. Okay, I'm going to say the same kind of thing about the piece of chalk, right? If I had thrown the chalk upward, the chalk would have risen. Okay? It's at least a parallel kind of thing, right? This is the thing, is the releasing the chalk that causes, given the whole set of circumstances, which you always a set of circumstances, whatever you're talking about, whether you're talking about S or a piece of chalk or whatever. And this particular event, my releasing the chalk, caused the chalk to fall. Just like her choosing to do A caused her to do A. So I can talk about whether the chalk would have fallen if this thing hadn't been there, but something else had instead. Like, for example, my throwing the chalk upward instead of just releasing it. It would. The chalk would have done something else if the condition had been different. So, here's what I want to say about this, right? That you can say of any event that ever happened, right? Whether it involved a person, whether it involved a dinosaur, or whether it involved a diamond or a piece of chalk, whatever, that whatever it was doing, whatever it did at a certain time, it would have done something else if the conditions had been different just before that. If you're just thinking about things in terms of actual events as opposed to a diamond just sitting there or whatever, think of any kind of event you want, it wouldn't have happened if the conditions had been different just before that. Something at least slightly different would have happened, often something very different. So it's a universal truth about everything that happens, including human behavior, that if the conditions had been different, if leading up to that, if what was leading up to it was something other than what actually was there, if something else had been there instead, it would have produced a different effect. Right? So you can say, obviously you can't say that you don't want to start thinking about chalk as having free will. And the compatibilists don't want to think that way either. But they've got to face up to this fact that all they've got going for them in terms of capturing the notion, really capturing the essence of freedom, is that the person could have done something else. Nobody was interfering with them, right? But this turns out to mean, according to them, that you could have done something else, that you would have done something else if you had chosen, made a different choice. And, yeah. This may be the last two things I'll write more, right? S would have done something else if she had chosen to. Okay. The chalk would have done something else. If I had tossed it upward. And what these two things have got in common, the basic structure of it, the basic idea of them, is this. Let's put it this way. Either, both S in the piece of chalk would have done something different. If, let's put it this way, if something else had happened earlier. In the case of the piece of chalk, it's whatever I do to it that's different. In the case of S, it's whatever choice she makes is different. Right? If her choice had been different, her action would have been different. If what I did to the chalk had been different, the behavior of the chalk, the motion of the chalk would have been different. In both cases, you're just saying, if things had been different earlier, things would have been different later. So that's something that you can say about everything, every event in the world, whatever the thing is that's doing the behaving or the acting. It wouldn't have behaved that way, it would have been behaved some other way if things had been different before that. So the supposedly core idea of freedom that you've got here, namely the ability to do something else, right? So it's just up to you, right? This thing here, that you could have done something else. If all that means is that if you had made a different choice, you would have done something different, then you can say a parallel thing about absolutely everything in the world. It would have behaved differently if things had been different before. So, some of you are already a half a step ahead of me, I suspect, so let me finish this, and if necessary, come back. It looks like what the compatibilists are now up to. I mean, they have to admit this, right? I haven't said anything the slightest bit controversial here. They have to agree that it's true of any event that it would not have occurred if there had been a different situation earlier. So since you can say that there's the same kind of thing, right? That the thing would have behaved differently if the conditions had been different just before it, about anything in the world, you can't surely have picked out the thing that is responsible for the fact that we have free will. I mean, right, if what you're saying is you can be said about anything, not just about us, but about a piece of chalk, then you haven't glommed onto the concept of something having free will. At least not yet. There's one possibility that as far as I can see, the only thing that a compatibilist can say at this point is, yeah, I lied. No, there they are. I may be okay. I don't want to fill up another board on you. The only thing I can see that the compatibilist can say is, look, Chalk doesn't make choices. Chalk doesn't have the power of choice. And I agree, it doesn't have the power of choice. I'm not suggesting that the chalk could have chosen to do something else. I'm just saying that chalk would have done something else if things had been different. And that's in certain ways, right? And that's what's being said about S, that she would have done something else if things had been different, namely in that case if she'd made a different choice. But so the compatibilist can grab onto this phenomenon of choice and say, look, what's true is that that the fact that it's her choice that explains her doing something, that means that she's got free will. Right? It's true. You're right, Johnson, about what you're saying. That you can say the same thing about everything. It would have done something else if the conditions had been different. But what's special about the conditions with human beings is when they're exercising their free will, is that they do things because of their choice. Their choosing to do this is what causes them to do that. Right? That's, and I can imagine, if Ayer were still with us, he's unfortunately gone, but if he was still with us, he might even buy this. He said, yeah, you're right. It's not just enough to say that she could have done something different. If things had been different, she would have done something different. It's if things had been different in a very specific way. If she had chosen to do something different, then she would have done something different, right? It's the fact that this is important, that her behavior, her acting results from her choice. And chalk doesn't have choice, right? So, they want to say, try this again. I know this is nasty stuff. I'm not going to ask you to explain this particular thing to me, but I do want you to try to think about it, because it's the final bit in the free will problem, I think. They're going to agree with me that you can say similar things about everything in the world. Namely, that it wouldn't have behaved the way it did at a certain time if the conditions had been different just before that. That's true of everything. What's true about human beings is something much more specific than that. Namely, that they would have done something else in the case where they're acting of their own free will. They would have done something else if the conditions had been different in a very specific way, namely if they had chosen to do something else. So what does that get you? Well, here's what it seems to me it gets you. That you've got to, you started out, remember, here's the way to put this. The problem starts of freedom and determinism with people thinking, if everything's determined, it's just, it's been determined from the get-go, right? Everything just has to follow the rails. All the causal laws are operating and they govern everything. Right? It's hard to see how you're going to get free will to be possible in a world like that, because everything that happens was caused by something else, and you go back to stuff that was out, way beyond the time when the person was even born, and the whole causal chain leads up to this. And in some sense, nothing else could have happened. Right? In order for anything else to have happened, you would have had to have a violation of Mother Nature's laws. So how are we going to get? What kind of a concept of freedom can we have that fits into a world like that? And what I've said in 2 steps here is this: that their first idea is to say, well, obviously it has to be true in some sense that they could have done something else. What that means is that they would have done something else if they had chosen to. And I point out that you can say a very similar thing about everything, right? That it would have behaved differently if the conditions had been different. And now they want to zero in on the fact that when human beings are behaving freely, it's the fact that their behavior results from their choice, right? They choose to do this and then they do it, right? and say that's why they're free. But now, right, a choice is just one kind of event in the world. It's just as determined, according to these guys, right? It's just as determined as any other event. It's got a complete causal explanation. So both the chalk and we have got this is true of both of us, right? That the world couldn't have been any different just before the chalk fell or before I did whatever I did. Because the way it was already determined by something before that, right? Nothing in the world could have been different without there being a violation of laws of nurture. And so now what it all comes down to, right? We agree about everything being determined. We agree about the idea that everything would have behaved differently if the conditions had been different. And now we want to single out human beings and say that they've got free will because what causes their behavior is different from what causes other beings' behavior. Namely, choices. Right? Choices are these things. Because our behavior is determined, is the result of our choices, it's free. But in whatever sense it's true, and there's a fairly strong sense in which it's true, that no piece of chalk could ever have done anything other than what it did, because the laws of nature required it to do what it was doing, so to speak. It's also true that no human being could have done anything other than what it did. In whatever sense, right, it's literally true that chalk couldn't have done anything different. It's also true that a human being could not have done anything different. Right? To do something different would have required a violation of the laws of nature. So I'll get you in just 1 second. To now say, well, the difference is that our behavior is caused by a particular kind of cause, namely choices, right, makes them free, even though admittedly, right, we couldn't have made any other choice because making that choice was something that was determined, right? And so if there couldn't have been anything else that happened without violating the laws of nature. Yes?
So basically what you're saying is the world turned out the way it was because that's how it was supposed to be?
Well, I don't know about supposed to be, but I mean
the actions taken by everyone were already decided because of the influences that they had from everything.
Yeah, right.
So we don't really have choices. It's already been determined that we make choices.
That's the problem of free will. If you think the universe is deterministic, that events are completely caused, right? That there is for every event there is a previous event that was sufficient to bring it about. So the baseball hitting the window was sufficient to make it break. Right? That's what causation is. If every event there is like that, then nothing else, including human behavior, ever could have been any different than what it was. Exactly what it was.
That goes back to how criminals can't be.
Oh yeah. That's the whole hard determinist argument. It has horrendous consequences. What I said when we started on this topic is it's the hardest topic there is to think about, and it's not just because I think there's no way out of this hard determinist picture. I don't see any way to make any sense out of it. But it's also hard. I mean, you can't. If you start thinking about how you think about yourself, suppose it is true that whatever you're doing, right, it was guaranteed you're going to be doing it right now. You're just holding your collar there. That was guaranteed 1,000 years ago, right? It's built into Mother Nature. So I mean, here's this faintly humorous thing. You put on a particular pair of socks one morning, okay? You think it was up to you which pair of socks to put on, but in fact it wasn't, right? That was guaranteed also. But when you have that picture, you can't say, well, there's a certain pair of socks that I know is going to wind up on my feet this morning because it's been guaranteed by the laws of nature for 100 years. Why should I bother putting them on? I'll just wait and see which ones wind up there. Well, that makes no sense, whatever, right? I mean, you're putting them on as part of the story that's been determined for 100 years. If you just sit there, they won't be, right? So, and there are all kinds of questions that you think about, in trying to think about yourself, that are just kind of maddening if you think of yourself as a completely determined being. But there it is, folks. Yes?
Doesn't this entire argument holistically fall apart because of quantum theory?
No, I don't think so. I mean, first of all, quantum theory, it has non-deterministic events, but they are, at least as far as I know, it relies on statistical regularities. And they aren't, yeah, right. I mean, so it's not, you can't predict the behavior of a particular particle, but you can say 2 out of 3 of them are going to do this under these conditions or whatever. But also it's true that above the quantum level, above the atomic level, it is nearly enough true that in the so-called macroscopic world, it really is a deterministic picture, and so that kind of probability doesn't enter into it. I mean, it's like, well, never mind. Let me just stop there. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah.
So you're saying the problem is with the free will is that everything happens from another. Every event happens from another event.
Well, that's the original problem. That determinism seems to be a threat to freedom, and so you've got these 2 attempts. The hard determinists are perfectly happy with that, but you've got 2 attempts to figure out how freedom can exist in a world like that. And well, actually, only one. I mean, the libertarians just say, look, the world is not deterministic. Human beings sometimes just actually start things on their own. But the compatibilists think that's a crazy view. They can't understand that. But they also think that our basic idea of freedom is, is the way Ayer talks about it, behaving in character, doing things because you want to, you're not being interfered with, right, and all that. And so this is how they want to think about freedom. But then you get down to the nitty-gritty and say, well, okay, that's how you want to think about it. Now you've got to explain to me, right, how you've got what this concept of freedom is that you've got, how it fits into a deterministic world, which is what they're trying to do. They say, yeah, that's our idea. It does fit in, and then you get this long story about how it fits, right? That you're not being compelled to do something, you're not constrained to do it, you did it because you chose to do it, etc., etc. It all sounds very nice until you start looking at the details, and you get that these guys agree that your choices are determined. Right? So there's some sense in which you couldn't have made a different choice. You can say, well, you would have made a different choice if things had been different before that, etc., etc. You can say that about everything. Right? So as far as I can see, you simply can't get, on the compatibilist view, you can't get a coherent idea of what the freedom is supposed to consist in, because of the fact that you can say the same crucial thing about everything, that it would have behaved differently if the situation had been different. And the only thing these folks can grab onto at that point is to say, well, but our behavior is determined by choices, and that makes it special. And so you just have to say again, well, you couldn't have made a different choice without violating a law of nature. So what interest is it that you could have made a different choice? I mean, or what would have happened, rather, if you'd made a different choice? You couldn't have. Sorry.
Just real quickly, would hard determinists completely reject the science of statistics in the macroscopic world?
No. No. But they, I mean, why? You say that there, you think there's some ultimately... You're thinking there's some ultimately statistical events that are macroscopic as well?
Yes. Well, I mean, even like the couple of Van der Waals horses pushing a sperm a little bit to the right or left could change what DNA comes in contact with an egg. How could they say it's only at the microscopic level, and it seems kind of arbitrary to say, well, yes, it's true microscopically, but it's not true anywhere else. Like, what's their...
Why do you think it's true? What was the subject you've done?
Macroscopic world, like...
the eggs you were talking about.
Yeah, Van der Waals horses, a different, slight difference in the shift of the kernel or something, a different sperm gets
right.
to an egg, that would lead to a different person with different innate characteristics, which would lead to different choices.
Right, but why do you think the slight shift in the forces wouldn't have an explanation?
Van der Waals Or like if something
Is it-
resulted from the quantum physics level.
Oh. So you get this a so-called random event of the quantum physics which radiates up into the. Yeah. I mean.
Well, incredibly rare that I don't think anyone can say that has never happened in the history of the world.
What
That something radiated up.
Oh yeah, no, I wouldn't. I'm certain I'm not going to make a claim like that. But how to put this? These guys, this view is just worked out in terms of what they're interested in is just the question whether determinism and freedom are compatible. Right? So they're just taking determinism. Now, if you want to say, well, would it help if instead of having a deterministic world, we had one in which some random events, let's suppose they're actually random, right? There's no statistical regularity or anything. Sometimes, had effects that percolated up to the macro level. Then the air is going to be back on the attack and say, I hope you don't think you're going to be introducing freedom by introducing a randomness, because it just means there's no explanation. And it's so, I mean, again, it's a good question, both of you, about sort of whether, but that's a different question, right, from the question of whether you can take determinism and somehow fit freedom in with it. Yeah. Okay, folks, how close did we come? It's almost time to go anyway. The Euthyphro on Tuesday.
So this never goes into the question about, okay, well,